shonen, shoujo, josei, and seinen. If you've been part of the anime and manga community for long enough, there's no way you haven't heard of these terms at least once. People get heated over them, they argue about their meaning and definitions and what counts as one or the other, and I'm guilty of that too. The amount of times I've found myself in this discussion is part of the reason why I've made one of my very first videos on this exact topic. I even once found an old forum thread from 2001 with people discussing about these things. It's a debate that the community has had for decades. And yet, I still think there's something that still needs to be covered. Something that through all of the discussions gets muddied and tossed aside. There's one question I want to ask you, and I want to think hard on the answer, because that's the point of this video. But before I ask you that, we have to define exactly what these terms are, what they mean, and how the community uses them, so that we can have all the context necessary to think about this question. So let's start. What are these terms? Well, again, I've made a video on it, but it's old and rough, so here's what you need to know. Manga are published in anthology magazines. These target different people. Some of them target gamers, other players of Mahjong, but normally they target people of certain age and gender. Kudomo magazines are targeted at young kids, shonen at male teens, shoujo at female teens, seinen at adult males, and josei at adult females. Kinda. There's a couple different demographics that target adult women, but in the West we tend to put them all in either shoujo or josei. There are also hentai magazines, which you know what they are, and in the same vein, there's also BL or Boys Love and GL Girls Love magazines. You may have noticed, however, that I use the word magazines and not manga. This is the first main point of discussion. Normally what we call a shonen manga are just manga that are published in shonen magazines. Fairy Tail is a shonen manga because it's published in a weekly shonen magazine, literally called Weekly Shonen Magazine. It's an easy and objective way to define these things. You don't need to wonder if K-On! Is a shonen or a shoujo, because by knowing that it's published in a seinen magazine, you know that it's a seinen, it's factual. However, things aren't always that easy. There's manga like Orange, which started in a shoujo magazine but moved into a seinen one, or Dorodoro that started in a seinen but moved to a shonen, or Villain Saga that started in a shonen but moved to a seinen. How do we define these things? I'm generally asking. With things like Villain Saga that had 99% of its run in the seinen magazine, it's more easy to define it as such. With JoJo Bizarre Adventure that had 6 parts in Shonen Jump but then moved to a seinen magazine, can be defined as having 6 parts that are shonen and others that are seinen. These demographics aren't 100% simple, but they do help define things for 99% of the cases. But if you've been part of this community for long enough, you are aware that most discussions happen for those 99% of things. Mostly things like Hunter x Hunter should be a seinen, or that Lavina should be a shoujo, so why? Well, most people don't use demographics the way that I just defined, and it's not easy as to say that people don't know what these terms mean, because I do think that most of them do to a degree. Shonen is for boys, so it becomes this action-packed battle anime and manga that dominate the industry. Battles like Naruto, Bleach, Dragon Ball, One Piece. Seinen is for adults, so it becomes this darker, more mature style of manga. Things like Berserk, Villain Saga, Goodnight Pum Pum. Shoujo is for girls, so it becomes the more romantic series like Horan High School Host Club, Kimono Todoki, or Fruits Basket. And the thing is, every single anime and manga that I mentioned is from those demographics. They are correctly attributed. But by just using these terms as to what they mean, it stops being factual and it turns into a deeper mass to talk about. We start calling things like Attack on Titan a seinen because it's more violent than most other shonen. We start calling things like Pandora Arts a shoujo because it's drawn in a little bit of a softer style and has a big female audience. We start to use those definitions to mean what we think people in those demographics want and to push our own agendas. Chainsaw Man needs to be a seinen because I like it and I'm an adult and I cannot like things for kids. So I need this to be a seinen so I can feel better for myself. I don't like romance because romance is girly stuff made specifically for girls. That's why it's shoujo. Yes, I will ignore the fact that this romantic manga is about 3 women with big boobs fighting over a nerdy dude. It's still for women, damn it. Now, here's the thing, I don't expect everyone that interacts with manga and anime to have a full knowledge of what these terms and demographics mean. You don't need to know that Naruto is published in Weekly Shonen Jump and know what that means to enjoy Naruto. You can just read the manga, watch an anime, and have fun with it. It's understandable that a lot of people don't know exactly what these terms are and where they come from, and they end up using it the way that they do. Hopefully, if you want to discuss these things, you'll eventually learn their meaning through the community. That's how I learned it. More and more often now, people are jumping in to explain what these terms mean to newcomers in the most threatening and aggressive way possible. Because you are fucking nerds. However, it's on this side of the fence that I think there's still interesting questions to be had. We often argue that these demographics don't matter, that you shouldn't care if Attack on Titan is a seinen or not, because by virtue of something like K-On! Being a seinen, there's no meaning to it. It doesn't matter. Things made for older men in mind is not really a defined genre. It can be horror, sports, action, romance. And so that will lead us to the question. And I want you to pause it and think for yourself about your answer, because I don't want this video to be just about my own opinion on the topic. I want to know what you think. Alright. So, do they matter? In a world where Akunohana is a shonen and Blood on Tracks is a seinen, in a world where Uzumaki is a seinen but Tommy is a shoujo, do manga demographics matter? And pause. Hopefully you've thought about it and came up with your own conclusion. Originally, I was on the camp of no, they don't matter at all, but after watching the video What is Shoujo Manga by Colleen Manga Rex, I saw that she actually argued against this idea, and I think she actually made some really good points as to why shoujo is important for girls to have a space for manga written for them. I'm gonna leave the link to that video in the description below. Editor crashed here, so the video is gone. It's gone. So I asked Colleen, and she did a new video which is called The Past, the Present, and Future of Shoujo Manga, which covers more or less the exact same topics that video that I mentioned did. So she just privated that one and has this new one, which I'm going to be linking in the description below. She also covers the same topics of the importance of demographics, or at least the importance of shoujo as a manga demographic towards the end of the video. So I recommend you guys checking it out, checking your take, your opinion on it. Back to the video. We love to argue that these demographics don't hold much meaning, that they don't have tropes. But they do. For as much as I can pretend I can figure out the shoujo manga from a mile away because Tommy exists, that's not true. Most shoujo manga have traits that we can easily pinpoint. Softer heart, looser paneling, indeed a gigantic amount of romantic stories, and tropes for their male characters. And the same thing can be said about shonen. Bolder heart, a lot more action manga, a lot of tropes for their female characters. A lot of people like to ignore this for the sake of the argument, because the moment you acknowledge there is some tropes, you open the door for people to saying that X manga or Y manga should be this demographic because they also have those tropes, even though they don't need to exhibit those tropes to be part of the demographic. And so we look back. It's a paradox. So, do manga demographics matter? Well, they matter as much as they don't. We can't remove them for existing. Even if we remove the titles, they would still exist. The West, we don't have seinen, shoujo, or anything, but they still exist. There's a reason why when I was a kid I went to McDonald's, they gave me a Transformers, and they gave a Barbie to my sister. We can't just pretend that they aren't there. And look, I know, when we're discussing if something is made for boys or for girls, we will eventually fall back into discussions about gender roles, which is a very complex thing to talk about. And even with shonen versus seinen, we can fall back in discussions of how people mature at different rates and how things affect different people in different times. But I think that from an industry point of view, it will always be important to have an understanding of who your target demographic is, at least in general. I think it's good for us to have these things, because if you are a mangaka that want to write things for teenage girls, you have a space to do so. You don't necessarily have to worry about competing with Naruto. Same thing can be said if you want to write things about marriage or workplace problems. There are spaces for that, for both male-centric problems and female-centric problems. Recently, I've read a couple of 90s josei manga that tackle topics of sex, relationships, and body dysphoria, led by Kyoko Okazaki's Elder Skelter. These are all amazing manga that I love reading, but I will be the first to admit that these are titles that will resonate a lot more with adult women, especially those in straight relationships, than it will with me. And it's important for women to have a space for them, for readers to be able to find these stories, and for writers to be able to write them. And in that sense, demographics create a stable balance. It's the reason why I think it's stupid that we often argue that males in shoujo manga appeal to girls, and honestly the reason why I think it's stupid that a lot of people argue that the girls in shonen appeal to male teens. That's the point. Because of these demographics, the mangaka have places for them to write the stories that they want to write, for the people that they want to write. And if someone wants to write a more generic manga for the general audience, don't worry, because they do all the time. That's why we have so many outliers in each and every one of these demographics. We should also note that demographics don't work 100% like we pretend that they do. What we bring to the West is an oversimplification of how they work in Japan. Some magazines don't have demographics. Garo, one of the most important manga magazines in history, doesn't have any demographic. It's just considered an alternative magazine. The demographic is people who like weird shit. And like I mentioned in the beginning of this video, there are some magazines for gamers. Magazines that appeal to people who have specific consoles. There's even one just for ./hack games. Now these are normally thrown into shonen because gaming, but technically the audience are gamers, people who love those franchises and those consoles. Similarly, Kindai Mahjong can be considered a seinen magazine. It's a magazine that publishes manga about the game of Mahjong, which, as far as I'm aware, it's mostly played by adult males. But the magazine is targeting not adult males, but actually anyone that plays Mahjong and likes it enough to read an entire magazine full with manga about it, regardless of age and gender. There's a lot of demographics in magazines. It's fun to discover and discuss them, but it's not always useful as a reader. A lot of people love to argue that the problem with the community is that they use demographics as if they're genres. But I think the problem is one step further. I think the core problem is how us, not the anime manga community, but consumers of media in general, treat genres. Because it's easy to think that these discussions are only in the anime manga community, but as an avid music listener, I've seen very, very similar discussions in that community as well. Hi, this is the part of the video where I go into a tangent about music. I like talk about music, but I swear it's related to the video. Just bear with me. This is my favorite band of all time. They're called 9 Inch Nails, and they're a 90s industrial band, and I probably just pissed off a couple of people. I don't actually know how many of them are actually also manga fans that will find this video, but industrial music has a very puristic fan base. People who love dropping whistle and don't want the genre to be associated with acts that don't sound like them, which, with 30 years removed, dance music, metal, and rock influences, 9 Inch Nails sounds nothing alike. But because the band is actually one of the few that are mainstream in the genre, that leads to a lot of people hating 9 Inch Nails, not because of its sound, but because of the genre that is associated with. I'm someone who loves music genres. 9 Inch Nails has led me to industrial rabbit hole that led me to discover dropping whistle, as well as a plethora of other bands that sound strange and weird, but I love to listen. But I more often see people using genres as something to limit themselves. Like I know it's gonna piss off some people, but I don't really like hip-hop. Yes, the real dude who grew up with 90s and 2000s hot rock music doesn't like hip-hop. A shocker, I know. But that's the thing, I don't really grew up with the genre, and it never interested me as much. And then To Pimp a Butterfly came out, and everyone and their moms were raving about it, so I decided to give it an honest, genuine try, and I didn't care about it, and that helped me solidify the idea that I just didn't like hip-hop. The genre just wasn't for me. That wasn't until I found Dialect, spelled like this. It's not really a popular artist, at least as far as I am aware, but it's one that resonated with me a lot. And since then I've discovered other acts that I love, like Run the Jewels and Clipping, and that has led me to never dismiss an artist or album just because it's hip-hop. And while I'll admit that I still don't care for the vast majority of hip-hop that I still listen to, I have found a lot of artists and songs that resonate with me a lot. And those are songs I would never have found out, I would never have listened to if I just used hip-hop as a barrier. That's what people do. The problem is not people using demographics like genres because they serve similar roles. The problem is how people use genres. People use these genres as a way to define expectations not in content, but in quality. And they do the same with demographics. But the demographic shouldn't matter. There is much bad shonen as there is bad seinen. You might like how a lot of shoujo looks like, and I think that's fair. Everyone has their own tastes. But even if you only like 1% of all the shoujo that ever existed, that's still a lot of manga that you would love if you just give it a try. Demographics have their role, but their role shouldn't be to limit you to find things that you'd love. But if you want me to babble even more about this, I made a video criticizing specifically seinen elitists and their bias. That is the video on the left, and if you watch until here, thank you very much, and I'll see you next video.